Well, my name is John Murphy. You're watching the Pan American Express today. This is the fourth in a new series of programs that we're doing with Media Services here at Eastern and WECS and the Center for Community Engagement. We're doing a half-an-hour program each week on the radio. We're capturing it on the TV as well to share on Channel 195, which is the Eastern channel on the Charter Cable Public Access System. If you go to Channel 195, it's in 17 towns in our region, and we're trying to make these interviews available through all local channels, radio, internet, YouTube, and Channel 195, and we're focusing on different guests each week, connecting the people at Yukon with our larger communities. So we welcome all of you aboard, however you're watching us today. We're going to focus on the elections for this program and the first of a series of interviews with candidates for the 2nd Congressional District. And I'm very happy to have our first interview today with Jonathan Pelto, who's running with the Green Party. First of all, Jonathan, welcome to the program. It's great to have you in the studio today.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this historic series that you're doing.
Yeah, we're very happy to be able to combine local media to get people connected to the community deeper and more meaningfully. And we have a nice half an hour to share with Jonathan over many issues. This is certainly a most unusual campaign year, historically speaking, with a lot of bizarre theatrics at the highest levels nationally. As you decided to enter the campaign this year in this environment, what tipped the, you're so active locally with education and your blog, what inspired you to decide to enter the race this year and participate?
Well, as you point out, this is really at the presidential level. Bizarre is probably not even close to a term that's strong enough. We need to find something even more dramatic to describe what's going on at the national level. But it is an unprecedented opportunity for people to get involved in elections and in policy making. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that the way the media covers the news is they either do it always looking for a for and against if it's a piece of legislation, or covering candidates. But when you're talking about issues like I've been doing for these past 5 or 6 years that I've focused in on education issues, what I found was it was really hard for the media to focus in on that if it wasn't related to a bill or related to a candidate. And so when the Green Party asked me to be their standard bearer and to run for Congress to try to hold the line so that they'll be able to be on the ballot next year, they were looking for somebody who had some name recognition, who was willing to go out and campaign. Right. But it also struck me as a special opportunity to talk about the kinds of issues that I've been talking about and other issues that are pressing our society, and making sure that those issues get addressed in the campaign. I mean, one of the things that we'll undoubtedly talk about is that when congressmen run for re-election, men and women, they tend not to be either opposed or they don't have really contested races.
That's
in
true.
The United States, about 94% of the incumbents win every time, and in fact, less than 1 in 10 really have any kind of race whatsoever. And so in this case, while Joe Courtney has done a very admirable job, and I've supported him in the past and given him money, I decided to run, not so much to run against Joe, but to make sure that these issues get debated. Because if you don't have much of an opponent and you don't really have to campaign, most incumbents don't do that. And so hopefully this is a way to infuse some issues, education issues, tax issues, other issues, into the public debate so that it gives voters more opportunities to learn and understand the issues and hopefully get involved.
This really touches something that's a great concern of mine, which is the quality of our democracy is really suffering. We do have all these media channels, but as you mentioned, they are trying to draw a large audience with a lot of theater. It's always the horse race or the sensational soundbite. But there's so many ideas that are not getting discussed that are very interesting to look at, to figure out where can we find some new solutions. They've covered so much of the middle that either the progressive or the conservative sides are stressing over the fact that ideas themselves are lost in the mix, and people can't honestly, intellectually sustain a long conversation about real change beyond a theatrical quick fix. And the process, to me, is really struggling, whether it's the Greens or the Libertarians or the other minority parties. And the media is really, to me, part of the problem, that they're not letting people connect to real information.
That's right. Absolutely true. We joke tongue-in-cheek that this campaign will be decided in 140 characters or less, that it's really a Twitter campaign. And it's a joke, but it's funny or sad because there's a lot of truth to it. And if you watch the news, what you find is the only thing that's being covered is the latest outrageous statement or the latest slippage by one candidate or another. And there's really no discussion. I mean, one of the things that has really bothered me, for example, and it combines with what is defined to be politically appropriate to talk about during campaigns. One of the issues that I've been talking a lot about is the need for us to restructure our tax system. And that's not something that politicians like to talk about. Nobody wants to talk about raising taxes, but in fact, the system that we have in place coddles the rich. They don't pay their fair share, and major companies don't pay their fair share. So the middle class has to pick up the extra burden and is really unfairly being burdened by both the Connecticut tax structure and the national tax structure. Well, when you start to talk about those issues, and I've been talking about them to reporters, you can see that their attitude is, look, unless you can get it down to one sentence, it's not going to get into the story, it's not going to get onto the news. The tax system is so important and has such an impact on everybody in this country that if we try to define it by one sentence and one sentence only, we'll be left with the kind of unfair system that we have. And so people have said, well, you really want to talk about taxes in an election year? And my answer is, that's the time to talk about taxes, because we need people to understand the positives, the negatives, the ups, the downs, the complexity of the tax structure, and the need to change that, or they're going to continue to be unfairly burdened by the kind of system that we have in place.
Well, one thing I want to do a couple of times during our conversation with Jonathan is give some information to follow up on our chat today, some website information. If you want to get more details on the campaign and his various positions, you can go to jonathanpelto.com. That's JONATHAN, jonathanpelto.com. It's his blog. And the party website is peltoforcongress.com, and you can get a lot more information to follow up on this. Well, let's stay with taxes for just a minute since you brought it up. And one thing I wanted to ask you in particular was, at the federal level, there's one level of operation, but there's always the state and local levels. And sometimes the connections that go from local to federal get blurred or they're lost. Do you have any sense at the federal level how you might help with communication and coordination of change so that whatever happens at one level is congruent or consistent with others, so the mechanism itself is more efficient?
That's right. I think a good example, and certainly one that this audience is more likely to understand than a lot of other audiences, is let's take something like student financial aid, where there's federal programs. The grant programs have been relatively limited. The loan programs have been expanded. And their attitude is, well, that's the solution, take loans instead of grants. But of course, I have one child who just graduated from college and another one headed to college next year. And the kind of debt burden that's being taken on, I actually put it in my name rather than in my child's name, because otherwise they would never have been able to afford to buy a car or buy a home or any of the kinds of American dream issues that we all grew up saying that's what it means to be an American and to have the economic ability, and now we've set up a system. Well, the lack of communication between the federal system and the state system is that Connecticut also has a program of grants and loans, but they don't work together effectively. And so as a college has a system of grants and loans, the state has a system of grants and loans, the federal government has a system of grants and loans. All of them have been shifting to less grants and more loans. And to the extent that there is any communication, one would want to say, okay, this has become a real problem. How are we going to deal with it? And one of the most obvious ways in the short term to deal with it is we now have record low interest rates, and yet the federal government doesn't allow parents or students to refinance their loans. When I have my home mortgage, I can go to the bank and I can say, look, I understand you now have a loan at 4%. I was paying 8%. I'd like a better interest rate, and if you don't give it to me, I'll go to another bank. And that's exactly the way the quote-unquote free market system should work. Well, we've got loans. My daughter and I have loans that are in the 7.9, 8%. The banks that have lent that money, they're getting that money at 1 or 2%. So they're making such a huge amount of money on top of all of the other ways the banks are ripping us off. So what I would hope would be that the federal, state, and even the individual universities would be able to communicate about a joint strategy to make it easier for people to go to college, less reliance on loans, more use of grants, and where there are loans, that they be set up in a much more open and honest way than the system that we have in place now.
That's a great example because it affects everyday life of families, and it certainly is an area that's continuing to be confusing and very stressful. And when some people make money off others, that gets to be a habit, and then changing that system becomes very hard.
That's right. And I think most people understand that there's something very wrong with the system. They just may not understand all of the details or may not know who could solve it. Part of the problem is that Washington has become so incredibly both corrupt and incompetent that nothing gets done in Washington. And one of the things that I think we all need to demand, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, Green Party, Libertarian Party, what voters need to say is politics as usual is simply not acceptable. If we're going to re-elect incumbents, they better go down there and start doing something positive and not just fighting among themselves. The banking issue is a perfect one. I saw a news clip yesterday that just the top 3 banks alone are really robbing us of $6 billion worth of ATM fees and overdraft fees. You think of how much money they're making on student loans and how much money they're making on ATM fees. And banks, which only 5-6 years ago were wanting federal bailout and we were giving taxpayer money to keep banks afloat. Banks are now making record profits, and they're making record profits off of students, off of the middle class, off of people who are trying to make ends meet and who haven't had the kind of economic renewal that these banks have had. So, you know, again, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, right wing or left wing, there needs to be a consensus that says here are some real problems, and those problems need to be dealt with, and we need to talk about them. And it may not be traditional to talk about them in political campaigns, but in fact, this is exactly the time to talk about them.
Well, this is a good segue to some of your main points on your campaign this year is about campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics, because the banks structurally have not been fixed in many ways. They're still very much in the same situation they were in '08 before the big bubble burst, and they've come up again with another scenario. And it's it has to do with the influence of lobbying and folks who are up for sale. At the national level, when you be working in the Congress, how do you think you can help with that process of trying to have money in its place and have the process itself not so vulnerable to abuse from any point of view?
That's right. I mean, first and foremost, there's a constitutional amendment that needs to be passed that requires that Congress pass legislation that gets money out of politics. Because of the Citizen United Supreme Court ruling 5 years ago, Congress is limited in what it can do, and it has used that to their advantage by going exactly in the wrong direction as opposed to pushing the country in the right direction. So that's one very technical step that has to happen. But secondly, there are lots of smaller steps that can work. One of the things that's happened over the last 5 years is it's gotten less and less transparent. We now have the majority of money that's being spent through these super PACs. We don't even know who the donors are. And if you go about at the very least saying every penny spent in a political campaign has to be revealed so that the public has an opportunity to look at who's giving the money to whom, while that doesn't necessarily stop all of the money, it certainly puts pressure on politicians. If they know that the public is going to find out who they're taking money from, you can be sure that they're going to be more sensitive to taking the kind of dirty money that they're taking now. The other is just the standard, and what we started with a few moments ago, is the power of incumbency, that if 95% of the incumbents get reelected, then you don't have a healthy democracy. I don't care whether those are good incumbents or not so good incumbents. The fact is you should have more turnover, you should have more opportunity for new blood. And this congressional race here in eastern Connecticut is a perfect example. The incumbent, a good guy, is going to spend over $1 million. Those of us that are challenging him are going to have $10,000 or $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 to spend against somebody who has $1 million. And he has $1 million because he's raising that from Washington lobbyists and political action committees and national groups that are pouring money into this race, as they are into races all over the country, in order to keep their friends and punish their enemies. That's really not something that politics was supposed to be for. Politics was supposed to be for an opportunity for citizens to hear their candidates speak out on the issues and then decide, do I want that person to represent me or do I want this other person to represent me? And so getting the big money out of politics and getting back to something that resembles democracy, I think, is good for everybody, even if it means that incumbents are not going to win quite as much of the time.
You know, that's one of the reasons why, I hope candidates can participate in the national debates besides the two major parties. Not being able to participate in a debate is a form of censorship. Even if someone is from a smaller party, if they're on the ballot, if you can vote for them, they should at some point have some equal treatment in these conversations. Because, like you're saying, a lot of these ideas are not even discussed, and during a debate is when they may get more attention than at other times.
That's right. That's right. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to spend the day with Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president. Very impressive woman, a former pediatrician, doctor out of Massachusetts, very articulate, has very strong opinions on a variety of important issues. I found that I felt very comfortable with the way that she was talking about those issues, and the sad thing was that she may or may not be allowed to participate in the debates. It looks increasingly like she won't be allowed to participate. We have 4 major candidates running for president. Trump and Clinton are the first 2, but then we have Johnson, the Libertarian,
That's right,
and Jill Stein, the Green Party. Jill Stein, just within the last couple of days, got 100,000 people to sign a petition demanding that she be allowed to be in those debates. And yet the mass media that runs the debates are saying, well, we don't really want anybody else in. And Clinton and Trump don't want anybody else in the debates. And so you have these 2 other candidates who have very important things to say. And even if you weren't for those candidates, you should still be for the idea of having them participate in the debates, because they will hold Trump and Clinton more accountable than they otherwise would be.
That's right. In case you've just joined us, we're just past the halfway point of a conversation with Jonathan Pelto. He is running for our Congressional 2nd District seat here in Connecticut for the region. And I want to mention, too, that there's going to be a debate here on the Eastern Campus in late October, sponsored in coordination with the Norwich Bulletin. And, of course, Jonathan will be part of the mix, and we'll let you know a lot more about that. But that should be a great evening to meet all the candidates and have a conversation here on campus in late October. Well, I'm kind of watching our time, Jonathan, which always flies, but I want to shift gears, if I could, a little bit to another issue that's very important in our state, and that is the environment, agriculture, food security. And in the role that you're trying to play now and with your background, what do you think are some of the things that you would encourage us to do from a viewpoint of environmental protection and stewardship?
Right, and we could spend the whole time talking about that really important issue. And I guess it would fall into 2 or 3 major categories. First off, Washington continues to debate about whether climate change is human-made or not human-made. And while there are still a few climate deniers, the vast majority of the debate is, are humans responsible for it or not? Now, the rest of the world recognizes that climate change is real and humans are a contributing factor, but we have to get past that and start talking about what are the real solutions. What kind of economy are we going to put in place? What kind of incentives are we going to put in place to dramatically reduce the amount of carbon? And if that's going to happen, it can only happen at the federal level. That the states can take small steps, baby steps, but we're not going to have the kind of real impact unless the federal government is involved with other nations, whether it's the kind of national treaties, international treaties that have been done to pass legislation to really reduce the amount of carbon fossil fuels and enhance the use of alternative energy. And so you have the whole issue of how do we get more use of renewable energy, and the economy has changed so dramatically around those issues. Solar energy is now clearly something that is very positive and can be used. Hydroelectric, wind energy. In 1974, when I was a kid, and it was when I started working for Chris Dodd, I wrote a paper on the energy crisis of 1974, and in that I talked about that someday there might be the possibility that wind energy and solar energy and hydroelectric energy was something that could be part of the American energy sources. And now here we are 40 years, 50 years later, and in fact those things are very available, and with the right kind of subsidies and the right kind of support, and not wasting all of our money on fossil fuels, we could be having a big impact. And then the other issue is really, as you had mentioned, the food safety issue. The genetically modified organisms that are now creeping into our food, that a day doesn't go by that we don't hear about new problems with food being recalled because of contamination. And one of the things that's happened at the federal level is Democrats and Republicans have backed off the responsibility of ensuring that our food supply is safe. And we have been in this never-ending war against terrorism, and in fact, I think it's fair to say that the far greater threat, at least in the day-to-day level, is not so much terrorism as it's defined through weapon systems, but terrorism or just merely our own, the possibility of our food sources being contaminated, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and no real mechanism to protect the public. And so whether it's what happened to Chipotle or what happened to other food restaurants or what's happened to, I mean, virtually, as I said, a day doesn't go by that you don't hear about some new recall of food that Americans are eating and getting sick. And again, the federal government needs to step forward and have the kind of systems in place with the kind of inspectors, and instead of cutting back on inspectors or privatizing the inspection system, needs to have inspectors in place and the ability to hold people accountable who poison our food supply.
You know, even things as basic as food labeling, so people know what's been done to the food, that is a huge issue that that lobbyists make a huge amount of money on, trying to keep label information from being off. Or, you know, what does it mean to have farmed fish these days? Well, how is that fish farm run? You know, what are the conditions? It sounds nice, but how clean is the water? How are the fish treated? And that becomes another issue with the food supply. So all these industrial concerns are really trumping the health of consumers.
And it's really sort of a sad statement about across the board that what's happened in this country is the pendulum has swung from a government that is actively involved in trying to protect the health and safety of people to one in which it's really on the government on and for the corporate interests that are out there. And so whether it's the military-industrial complex or whether it's not keeping our food sources safe enough or whether it's a tax structure that allows the rich to not pay their fair share, we see the same example over and over and over again, and that is this is not a government for and by the people. It's a government that is that clearly has its leanings towards protecting those who, quite frankly, don't need any protection. They're doing just fine. The 1% are getting richer and the rest of us are getting poorer, and the middle class is being squeezed right in the middle, and if we're not careful, they will be squeezed out of existence. And so we need a government that is going to be back involved. And that is both something that has to happen, and it also has to happen in a responsible way. I consider myself a liberal, and one of the reasons that I talk about needing a fair and equitable tax structure is so that we can pay for the kinds of programs that people need.
Right.
But I also believe we need a fair and equitable tax structure so that we're not so dependent on borrowing. The Obama administration is now on track to have doubled the national debt over the course of his 8 years. And that's because we have fought two major wars, an ongoing war against terrorism and a stimulus package that wasn't paid for. We borrowed the money to do that. If regular people tried to borrow money to live the way that the American government has been living, they would be run out of town. No bank would give them the money. Nobody would risk that kind of indebtedness. And yet the federal government is doing that. So I think you can be both and need to be both a liberal and fiscally responsible. And one of the reasons that we need a government that is more in favor of the people is that it needs to make sure that we're not building up this huge debt that's really going to crush our children and our grandchildren.
Well, you know, this brings us very close to an issue that I've been very concerned about for a long time, and that is military conversion. I remember doing some interviews with Sam Gatenson in the 80s, and Sammy was one of the first congressmen that I was aware of that was really talking back at that time about converting factories from military production to other things. Like during World War II, we didn't have a war machine. We created one in order to manufacture everything that was needed. And you mentioned Eisenhower at one point. You know, when he left office, he warned us about the military-industrial complex. It had not existed before, and it became a force that he was concerned about. And this is from the Supreme Allied Commander of World War II forces, president elected twice. And one of his last speeches before he left was to warn us about the influence of this military-industrial machine for things that go way beyond security. And when you bring up conversion, then you get into people calling you unpatriotic, or, you know, it's like a flag, or, well, half of the defense budget is jobs, so it's about jobs a lot of the time. And every congressional person from Connecticut, because of Groton, has struggled with, yes, you know, keep the base open, do we close the base? Do we buy more submarines? Do we have too many? How do we convert? how do you think we can do better with this and try to avoid the trap of being unpatriotic by saying, look, we have to rethink what our industrial machine is for.
That's right. And you couldn't have done a better job in describing what the problem is. And had we made the kinds of conversions that Sam Gadenson, or even before him, Chris Dodd, would talk about, yes, we need a strong military, yes, we need jobs in Connecticut and especially in eastern Connecticut, but we also need to be converting those industries to be making something far more productive so that when the war machine is not needed, and when we can shift resources to things that are much more productive and healthy and create a better life instead of take life away. And had we been doing those things, we now would have train cars built down in Groton as well as submarines. It's not that hard, it's not that complex, but what's happened is every year they've said, well, let's put that off. Let's just build the submarines. Let's not talk about converting those factories into making productive things. And so I'd say at the very least, let's just make a rule that says that for every dollar that's spent on military, 20 cents or 30 cents, 20%, 30% of that money needs to be used to convert those same industries into products that are positive for the economy and healthy for the economy and healthy for the people. Connecticut recently bought a bunch of used train cars. I think they came from Europe, but what was worse was they were built in Europe because we don't build train cars in this country. If you can build a submarine, you could certainly be building train cars. And so I think that the issue of the military-industrial complex is really twofold. The first is we need to convert those industries so that they're having a productive impact on the world instead of building weapons of mass destruction. And secondly, this idea that just because it's spent on the military, it's a good idea. I read the other day about a new aircraft carrier. It was supposed to be $10 billion. It's now $13 billion, and it's still not usable because they haven't figured out how to load the planes on, get the planes off, or for it to defend itself if it's attacked. And so you now have a $13 billion ship that's not usable. The F-35 jet fighters, $1 billion apiece.
Yep.
Just heard last week, it came out with a report from the Defense Department that they're not ready for prime time, 2 years behind schedule, well over budget. There was another article just the other day about a new series of ships that are being used by the Navy, 3 of which have already had to be pulled out of service because they don't work right. And so one of the things that's happened is not only have we been spending huge amounts of money, but we've been wasting that money because nobody has the guts to say, well, wait a minute. Do we really need that system? And if we do, what's the most cost-effective way to build it as opposed to just throwing money at the problem? And until we get away from this constant state of war, and until we get away from saying that just because you raise questions about the military budget, that doesn't make you unpatriotic. In fact, I would argue exactly the opposite. Raising questions about the military budget is actually the more patriotic position to take because it says, I want the country safe, but I also want the country safe by being financially sound.
We have a few minutes to go with our conversation with Jonathan Pelto, and I wanted to ask you, because we're recording this on the campus here at Eastern, to speak to our young listeners, folks today who are just newly voted, and I wonder if you have any thoughts for them, because you started as a very young guy. Actually, at the age of 11, you were kind of working on campaigns. Young people today, they are in a tough situation. They have huge academic debts. They're uncertain about the economy. They have employer situations where they don't know how to trust employers anymore. The idea of a young person going to a company, staying for a while and being well treated is really hard. So when you think about young audiences today, as a congressman, how would you connect them, beyond the election and the interest and the excitement, to staying engaged and to connecting their work energies to social change?
Yeah. Yeah, and part of it is rolling up your sleeves and getting involved, that there's no better way to understand what's wrong with the system. The best way to do that is to start working on campaigns and working on government issues and working on advocating for things, because you learn very quickly what that system is and what's good about it and what's not so good about it and what needs to change. But I think what you said about the jobs future is probably the biggest reason of all, and that is the days of having one employer and getting a big pension are gone. And those of us that are now older, when we started young, we're now older, quite frankly, we can limp over the finish line. It may be an ultimate disaster depending on what happens in this presidential election. But this country is going to be around, hopefully, knock on wood, for another 5, 10, 15 years. The question is, what happens over the 20-year period? What happens over the 40-year period? And if young people don't get involved, they're the ones that are going to pay the price in a way that older people never have to do it. I mean, the sad reality is that it's older people that are passing the laws, older people that are preventing the laws from being passed, and the younger people that are going to pay the price for it. And so the reason to get involved, for no other reason, is that it's going to affect them more than it's going to affect anybody else. And so that means learning about the process by participating, whether it's as a volunteer or a staff person, whether it's picking an issue and getting involved in it, but saying, I'm going to have an impact, because if I don't have an impact, then things are not going to get done. And if things don't get done right, then the kind of world that they want and deserve is simply not going to be around. Every generation that I know of in American history has always strived to make sure that the next generation had it better off than they had, in one way or another. Yeah. Sometimes it was more successful and sometimes it was less successful, but as a generation there was a commitment to build a better community, a better state, a better country, a better world. I'm convinced that the politicians that are in power today don't have that interest. They don't care what's going to be happening to the next generation, because if they did, they wouldn't be doing the things that they're doing now. And so it's as much of a plea or a demand that young people get involved, because if they don't, we're going to continue to see. I mean, one perfect example is a reasonable gun control and reasonable mental health services for those who might get hold of guns. And that is that if you look across at all these murders that are taking place and all these situations in school shootings, it's young people killing young people and old people deciding what the laws should be. And it's time that young people decide what those laws should be, because in fact it affects the young people far more, whether it's the kind of world we're going to have 40 years from now or whether we're going to allow these kinds of school shootings to keep on taking place.
Well, maybe this is a good way to kind of go full circle, is to talk about the election today, because it's so unusual. There are so many Republicans that are not happy with their candidate. There are so many Democrats that are not happy with their candidate. A lot of people are saying, well, I just won't vote this time. I'll take a pass. What would you say to people that are not decided, that are struggling, that have a certain leaning one way or the other, but they don't trust it right now, and they don't know where to go with this frustration?
Yeah.
Some people are looking at, well, let's take our energy and look at the grassroots state level, work locally, let the federal thing work itself out. What would you say to help people who are struggling with their decision as we come into the last 50 days or so of the campaign?
Right. I mean, the first thing I'd say is really try to find a way to vote, that in fact your vote does make a difference. And while the reasonable people are reasonably concerned about what's going on at the federal level and whether these elections are going to be open and honest, and what do you do when you have two candidates that nobody likes, we can't allow the enemy to win. And the enemy is apathy, and the enemy of people not participating in the political process, and the elite being able to decide the outcome. So the first and foremost, I'd say, go ahead and find a way to get to the polling place and pick a candidate to vote for. But I think you've highlighted the issue, and that is get involved in some issue. And local level is always going to be easier in the short term than than the federal issue or even a state issue. Get involved in some issue, start to make a difference in some way, and use that to build upon your experiences to have an impact bigger than that. I decided very early in life I had wanted to be involved in politics. It was only later that I decided to do something else when I was in my 30s. But I was elected to the legislature when I was finishing up my senior year at the University of Connecticut. And I was the youngest member of the legislature. And the reason that I got elected was because I worked harder than my opponent. It wasn't that it was anything magical about being younger. I was 23 years old, and I really believed in going out and talking to people, and I convinced a lot of people to vote for me. I was running against somebody who I knew well. It was the mayor of the town, the highest vote getter in our town's history, and I beat that person because I outworked them. And I went and said, look, I'd like to be the state legislator from the 54th House District. So it can be done. It's actually not that hard. You just need to get involved and get active.
Well, I want to give some information again in case you've joined us. If you'd like to get some more information about Jonathan and the campaign he's working this year, there's some sites you can go to. JonathanPelto.com is one site. That's the blog. You can also go to peltoforcongress.com, and you'll find out more information from the Green Party site. And also, John's had a blog for a long time about education issues. Wait What is the blog, Wait What blog, and it's extremely successful. If you want to find out about his ongoing work with education reform, that is the place to go. And we'll keep you informed of the debate coming up with all the candidates later in October. We're going to have them here on campus in coordination with the Norwich Bulletin, and we'll have a chance to hear Jonathan and the candidates right here on campus at some point before the elections. So, Jonathan, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. I wish you success with your campaign and your good work with education, and we'll look forward to continuing our conversation in the future.
Great, and thank you. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for making the time, and thank you for giving candidates an opportunity to be heard.
Okay. Well, we're coming up on the hour here at WECS Willimantic on the Pan American Express. We're going to take a few minutes now and feature some music from Brazil, one of my favorite places on the planet, and I always spend a little bit of time there each week. This is music now from Joyce from Brazil as we go back to our program.